And we are rolling. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good. So this is Mark Goldberg with the UN and Global Affairs blog UN Dispatch. Pleased and honored to be speaking with Suzanne Nossel, who's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the International Affairs Bureau of the State Department. Suzanne, we've had former ambassadors and former officials, but I do believe that you are the first sitting administration official to come on Blogging Heads, so thank you very much.
Thanks. Am I also the first former blogger to come on Blogging Heads?
You are. For those unaware, Suzanne was a founder of the excellent blog Democracy Arsenal, which is still is a must-read on the foreign policy field. Suzanne, so I guess we're going to talk about a few things today. We're going to, I think, probably focus most of our conversation on the Human Rights Council, which is something under your remit, which there are sort of interesting things happening in that world. But I think before we get into that, I wanted to ask you, I guess, about a few more sort of broader topics. And so one thing in particular I wanted to talk to you about is smart power. You are she who coined the term smart power in a foreign affairs article in 2004. And then during her confirmation hearing, Secretary of State Clinton, embraced rhetorically the concept of smart power to a great extent, mentioned the term a number of times during her confirmation hearing. I'd be interested in hearing from you is sort of the extent to which, or if at all, the Obama administration has manifested the rhetoric that Clinton used in her confirmation hearing in sort of real and actionable ways on the world stage.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I would say in terms of smart power, I think in many respects, yes, although, this administration's foreign policy obviously remains a work in progress. But I think what we do see is a lot of effort being paid to shoring up and building alliances, kind of creating foundations of support for important initiatives and really laying the groundwork. I mean, we see, for example, the nuclear summit that's taking place today, an initiative that started last September at the UN with the President's speech, and really very careful, meticulous groundwork being laid over many months to get to a point where there's really, broad support for the President's agenda. So I think that that's, to me, the kind of smart, careful work that I think the article kind of talks about. The article also talked about the importance of relying on different kind of arms of U.S. power and avoiding over-reliance on a single tool, for example, the military. And I think we see that as well. The Secretary's quadrennial diplomacy and development review, which she has initiated and is now underway, is an effort to make sure that our policies as far as diplomacy and development are every bit as thought through and strategic as our defense posture. So I think there is an effort to make sure that all tools of American power are fully utilized. Obviously, it's not perfect and not everything comes to fruition as quickly as one might like, but I do see some positive signs.
I guess on the nuclear summit, so we're recording this on Wednesday the 13th, which is the second day of the two-day nuclear summit. And sort of to kick off things this morning, President Obama said that, in fact, this sort of one-time nuclear summit is not going to be just a one-time deal. They're going to meet again in 2 years, this time in South Korea. Now, I'm wondering, are we seeing sort of with this nuclear security summit, are we seeing the emergence of a new architecture of international relations? Will, for example, the nuclear security summit become as much a part of international relations as, say, the G20 summits are currently?
I mean, it's hard to predict exactly, but I think there's certainly the hope that this can be a very constructive forum going forward. And, part of the effort of this administration, and particularly us working in the arena of multilateral affairs, is to try to evolve the structures and the forums to meet the challenges that we face. And I think the President's initiative, really is part of that. So, constructing forums, developing new forums, not being afraid to build on the strengths of certain longstanding forums, but also break new ground, I think is part of what we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, one of those institutions that the administration sought to engage early on is the Human Rights Council. I know that this falls pretty directly under your remit as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. I guess I want to ask you this. So when the United States decided, I guess it was probably about a year ago, to join the Human Rights Council, at the time, Ambassador Rice kind of presented it as, I think, a test of the Obama administration's policy of engagement. She said something along the lines of, we know that the Human Rights Council isn't working without us. We want to see if it will work better with us on the inside, trying to make it better than maybe complaining from the outside. And so it's been about a year since the Obama administration has had a seat at the council, and I'm curious to hear from you sort of how the U.S. has done at the council and how the council has done with the U.S. on it.
Sure. The decision was made, I think, roughly a year ago, but our first session at the council actually was not until September of 2009. So the 1-year anniversary of our participation will be in September of 2010. So there's still some months to go, and I think it is early days to make an assessment. We've focused very much so in joining the council on trying to enhance its credibility and effectiveness, based on the idea that the council is really not living up to the world's rightful expectations of the UN's foremost human rights body, a body that ought to be taking on tough situations, addressing them through concrete measures. Too often, this council is vulnerable to endless debates, is overly focused on particular situations, Israel being on the top of that list, is unwilling or unable to engage and respond to serious country situations and human rights crises. So there are a slew of problems to deal with. In terms of making headway, I think we do see some progress, although it's incremental. In our first session in September, we worked with Egypt on a resolution on freedom of expression, and that was a breakthrough in of itself because the Council, like the UN, but almost intensified, is subject to block dynamics where countries don't reach individual decisions on how to vote on a particular resolution. Almost all members of the Council are locked up in regional group blocks, be it the Organization of the Islamic Conference or the African group, and they kind of take their dictates from those regional group positions, and it often makes for kind of a lowest common denominator kind of political positioning where the country that's trying to protect itself can kind of shield themselves inside of a group and count on a whole block of votes, even in favor of a very regressive position. And we worked hard to break that down, and part of our outreach to Egypt was trying to demonstrate that we can cut across these group boundaries. We built on the President's speech in June of 2009 in Cairo, setting out a new agenda for American relations with Muslim communities around the world. And we tried to build on that in developing a quite far-reaching resolution on freedom of expression, working with Egypt. Ultimately, the resolution passed by consensus. We had 47 co-sponsors, and it was kind of acknowledged at the Council as something really novel and a positive step and illustration of what the Council at its best is capable of. In this past session, which just concluded at the end of March, we got the Council's first resolution on Guinea, addressing human rights conditions in that country after the massacre that took place back in September, and providing some technical assistance and focus to ensure human rights protection going forward there. We also took on a very challenging issue. There's been a move at the UN, both at the General Assembly and at the Human Rights Council in recent years, to take on the question of religious intolerance. Things like the minaret ban in Switzerland, the Danish cartoons, and other speech and actions that are offensive to members of religious groups. And it's a serious issue that we believe needs to be addressed. But the problem has been that the method that countries have advanced to address it has been one that we don't agree with and don't accept, which is the idea that you can counter religious intolerance by simply banning offensive speech. So if there's speech that's offensive to minority groups, the solution is some kind of a national or even a global ban on that speech, criminalizing that speech. Now, we don't agree with that. Based on our First Amendment principles, we believe that the antidote to offensive speech is more speech, and speech that sets the record straight, and that the truth will win out over time, and that measures that attempt to ban and suppress speech ultimately are going to backfire and boomerang and not help vulnerable minority groups. So we've actually taken on this issue in a frontal way at the Council, and we've gained some ground. In March, we saw a pretty dramatic shift in the vote count on the defamation resolution, a resolution that historically has passed with large majorities. All the big blocs, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the African group would vote routinely in favor, as well as Latin American countries. This time around, we were able to turn a lot of those votes, and the resolution still passed, but by a very narrow majority. We also got a consensus resolution that took a committee that some were trying to use to impose a global kind of blasphemy ban, an international treaty that would have banned speech. And we took that committee in a different direction, focusing more on positive measures that can be used to counter religious intolerance, things like anti-discrimination laws and hate crimes laws. And we're promoting that kind of an agenda that actually takes practical steps to address concerns relative to religious minorities. And we were able to get a consensus resolution that opens the door for this committee to focus itself in that direction. So we've seen some progress. Certainly there remains a lot more work to be done.
So, yeah, I mean, I think you described it at the beginning as sort of progress, but incremental progress. But I think it's fair to say it sort of hasn't, from an American perspective, been sort of all progress. The most high profile of these resolutions to come up in the past year was the Goldstone resolution concerning alleged war crimes or crimes against humanity that occurred in Gaza and in Israel during the December 2009, 2008, January 2009 sort of Operation Cast Lead there. In the U.S., I don't want to get into like the merits of the Goldstone Report itself. But the U.S. said that the report is flawed, and tried but failed to stop the report from being taken up at the Human Rights Council. I was wondering, sort of, what from I guess a vote counting perspective, what went wrong?
Well, Mark, it's not correct to say that we tried to stop the report from being considered at the Council. That's never been our position. We think the Council is actually the appropriate place to deal with the report, and that the report raises very serious allegations that need to be looked at, that can't be sidestepped or overlooked. We do think the report is flawed, that it draws a series of inferences about Israel's motives and behavior that simply are not supported by the facts. And in some cases, it's because the Commission was unable to get at the facts or get the Israeli perspective. But nonetheless, the inferences that were drawn on the basis of the record and the information that they had really are, in many cases throughout the report, kind of the most negative possible spin that you could put on Israeli behavior. So we do take exception to that, and we also see the report against this pattern of kind of relentless focus at the Council on Israel, a whole agenda, separate agenda item devoted to Israel, whereas every other country is dealt with in the world is dealt with under another single agenda item. So the backdrop is problematic. Nonetheless, the report does raise serious issues, and we've always said that those issues ought to be taken up by the Human Rights Council. You may be referring to the fact that in the September session there was a decision to defer consideration of the report, and that decision, then was followed pretty closely by another decision to call a special session to deal with the report and pass a resolution, which was done shortly after the conclusion of the Council's September session. Our focus now with the report is really on the idea that the primary responsibility to address the allegations in the report rests with the parties themselves, Israel and the Palestinian side, and that those are the entities most responsible for conducting thorough, credible, professional investigations and for holding individuals accountable where findings of human rights abuses are found to be substantiated. So those processes are underway. They're not completed. There'll be doubtless hot debate over the adequacy of those processes, and that's already begun. But we think that's where the emphasis ought to be, which is in seeing to it that the parties fulfill their own responsibilities relative to the allegations that have been raised in connection with the Gaza conflict.
All right, fair enough. I think also next month the Human Rights Council will probably pop up in sort of newspaper headlines again, and I'm sure viewers will come across it again because Iran is seeking membership to the council. And I'm wondering, from an American perspective, presumably, you don't want Iran on the council. I'm wondering sort of what are you doing to prevent sort of that outcome from happening?
Yeah, I mean, getting the right members onto the council and trying to ensure that those who participate in the council are kind of there for the right reasons because they're actually interested in promoting and protecting human rights, rather than in using the council as a political weapon or a political shield, is a very high priority for us. And so these elections are something that we take very seriously. When the council was created, the membership of the UN made a decision to have criteria and to ask countries to look at one another's human rights records as a key factor in determining who was worthy and deserving of membership in the council. So we're urging that criteria be applied, and we do think it's particularly important that it be done so, in connection with these elections in May, because really our participation and our ability to get things done is affected by who's on the council and whether they approach it with a seriousness of purpose or have a hidden agenda.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to get back to connect again the idea, your concept of smart power, sort of revamped liberal internationalism with the council. I guess, again, from an American perspective, what sort of good does it do to have a council in the first place, and also for the United States to join the council? And I'd be interested, I guess, most in sort of how is it that council resolutions sort of translate into sort of real action in places around the world? Because, most of what we hear about, these are just sort of resolutions without any real enforcement mechanism. I wonder, again, how do these resolutions become sort of tangible things that countries can point to or adopt?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I would say we're not satisfied with the degree to which the Council, through its resolutions and its other steps, is able to make a real impact on the ground. We would like to see that significantly enhanced. At the same time, if you talk to activists around the world, particularly in some of the world's most repressive countries, they actually really do care about what happens at the UN relative to the country that they're trying to put pressure on. And there is a stigma associated with being the subject of a council resolution that's condemnatory. So I think that really does pack some power, even though it may not, the impact of it may not be immediately tangible on the ground. I think it's a way of putting pressure on a government, of shining a spotlight on them, of strengthening the hand of human rights defenders on the ground who are able to say that the international community is siding with them. So I wouldn't underestimate that. The Council also has a platform for offering technical assistance to countries that are willing to accept help, that recognize that they have a ways to go when it comes to human rights protection. So that's another, that is more direct and immediately tangible, and I think is also something that can be strengthened. Frankly, you asked a broader question about, does the Council really accomplish anything? And I think, it does leave a lot to be desired. I think theoretically one would want the international community to have a Human Rights Council that really could be trusted to deal with the most serious abuses, to call them out, to put pressure on governments to address them, and we're a long way from that. But nonetheless, I think if you look at sort of the history of the UN's role in instantiating human rights norms, it is pretty significant. And, while there are many places in the world that have retreated backwards or that, may sign on to international human rights instruments kind of in name only without much intention to implement them in practice, overall, these tools, including both binding instruments and hortatory resolutions, do wind up being pretty powerful ammunition in the hands of advocates around the world. So I think there is some value to trying to get strong resolutions passed that highlight and address important issues. In terms of our presence on the Council, one of the things that I observe, having been out of government for a time and coming back in, that I think is probably more true now than it has been at times in the past, is that even when we're not there, things do happen. It's not as though by absenting ourselves from a forum like the Human Rights Council, we can simply put a stop to the work that's going on there. I mean, on an issue like defamation of religion, that kind of pernicious norm has gained some ground in the years when we have not been participating in the Council, and that poses a danger to people who are trying to exercise their rights of freedom of expression around the world. So being there in a defensive way is quite important. I think also, the work that we have done and will continue to do to address the most serious abuses is really necessary to try to, make a statement about what human rights means and about the international community's willingness and ability to stand up and defend it.
So, this brings to mind that there's another sort of international human rights-oriented institution of which the United States is sort of still not a member, the International Criminal Court. I'm wondering if you can describe, the sort of first half of the Bush administration was clearly very had a hard time, I guess, working with or even acknowledging that the ICC existed. Second half of the Bush administration, there was a bit of a rapprochement. I'm wondering if you could describe, I guess, how the U.S. relationship with the ICC has evolved, I guess, since the early Obama, since, in the first couple of years of the Obama administration, and if there's any sort of hope that from an engagement perspective, that the U.S. would sort of eventually join this thing.
Yeah, I mean, there has been an evolution, and this administration has made the decision to engage further and take the step of attending as an observer some of the ICC meetings and participating in the debates there and engaging with the issues that the states parties to the ICC are seized with right now, which will affect the future direction of the court. So I think that there is a deepening engagement. It's hard to speculate on how far that will go and exactly where it will lead, but that process definitely is underway.
Mm-hmm. I guess, what... you look at sort of the first years of the administration's engagement with international organizations, particularly with the UN, and what you see is a determined engagement of I guess what I would consider sort of what I would describe as having other countries help share the burden of the U.S. sort of leadership of the United States maintaining I guess a way to put it is that sort of is looking to institutions to add value to American power. And I'm wondering if you see this as well, and it's sort of what you see as the evolution of the administration's engagement with institutions like the UN.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's well put in that, the question is how can we work with institutions, not just the UN, but also regional and functional institutions, as tools of American foreign policy, as venues where we can advance our goals. And, I see a lot of our role within the Bureau of International Organizations as kind of understanding American policy goals and then kind of coming up with initiatives and ways of advancing them through the forums that we work with. So I think that is the approach. The question with a lot of these institutions is that, they are flawed. They're also the instruments of others' ambitions and others' policy goals. And so we're sometimes in a defensive posture. But I think, what you're seeing is, the beginnings of figuring out how do we build the coalitions that we need, how do we create a foundation of common ground behind the policy goals that we're wanting to advance, be it in the Human Rights Council or the Security Council. And, the early signs of perhaps some success in doing that on certain issues. But, I would say what we're finding in the Human Rights Council, and I think it's shared, is that, it's sort of slower than you think. There are more players that are playing a larger role than perhaps they did years ago that really are forces to be reckoned with. So it's not a matter of the United States imposing its will or, in a unilateral sense, setting the direction, but rather this kind of painstaking process of coalition building. And, the good news is if you're successful, what you have can be very strong and powerful and difficult for countries to circumvent. The bad news is that you have to do the hard work of getting others on board, and they don't always see issues eye to eye with us.
So we have about 2 minutes left. I wanted to maybe give you the chance to get a last word in. If there's anything, are there any other things that are coming across your desk that are not marked top secret that you wanted to get the word out on, that you want to talk about?
Just to say that we're very focused on this whole agenda. We're going about it in a very structured way. Its results are a little slower in coming than I think everybody would like, but we are seeing some early signs, I think, of real progress and openings in terms of new relationships with countries, openings in these very rigid block dynamics. So, I would just urge that it's too early to make real final judgments, and that you also need to understand the work of these institutions to recognize how significant some of the accomplishments are, even if it's sort of not yet a champagne moment.
Mm-hmm. So when can we sort of judge? When will it be time?
Hard to say. I mean, I think, get one administration. I mean, I think, if you look sort of, from a few steps removed, a 4-year time frame can be what it takes to really see a new set of players. I mean, it's also the case our new ambassador for the HRC, Eileen Donahue, started and was confirmed and came to Geneva for the first time in March. So all these pieces take time.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I don't want to keep you any further. Thank you so much for doing this. It was a pleasure, and hopefully we can chat again and get more State Department perspective into these Blogging Heads discussions. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Mark. It was fun. Bye-bye.